Today we are starting the first of our four-part DM workshop, which will focus less on the mechanical intricacies of the game and more on the meta things that you should start thinking about. Think of this more as a conceptual approach to DMing, rather than running through every minute rule that you will eventually learn playing and you can look up on your own. We will be covering 4 pillars of D&D DMing, starting with running combat, going to running social encounters, running exploration and skill checks, and then finally running the story, where we will focus heavily on homebrew campaigns rather than running a strict module, as that is the more popular option nowadays. Starting with running combat, though. We want to talk less about the actions that you can take in combat and the spells that you can cast and in what order everything goes, and more about what you should feel like you are doing as a DM when you are preparing a combat session. During preparation, the design phase has 3 things that you should principally think about. First, you should think about the difficulty of your encounter for your players. And I like to give my players kind of an alternating basis of combat difficulty. I like them to have some where they can feel like they are the most powerful people around, and have those sprinkled in among maybe, depending on the flavor of the adventure, maybe those might be 3 go by, and then there's one really, really hard one where almost everybody dies, or the reverse, if you're running a more high-stakes underdog kind of, where the players are the underdogs kind of campaign. So you should think about that ahead of time. And in order to look at that and help design and balance your encounters, we will have some tips later in the video. You should not rely on challenge rating alone, as that is only the beginnings of an indicator. The second rule of designing encounters is intention. You should think about what you want to achieve with this encounter. There are random encounters that are just there to give players a fight. There are encounters that demonstrate how dangerous a terrain is, or signal to somebody that this is not a signal to your players, this is not somebody that we should be messing with. And those kind of combat encounters can run very differently. If you want your players to run away from a combat encounter, that is something that needs to be signaled very, very quickly, because players should have an idea of the intention, not the exact idea. But if this is mainly a combat encounter to show off how threatening the big bad is and how far the players should be trying to get away from them, and you are on the 16th round, everybody is down and out, and there is one rogue who's managed to evade all the fireballs left, that rogue is probably going to die, and they're probably not going to run away. So you need to have that intention and be able to adjust your combat encounter to help fit that intention as things go around. The final piece is engagement. Combat encounters can often come down to just a standard slugfest of one party on the other. Maybe the bad guy has a couple of interesting effects. Maybe the party, the fighter uses their action surge. You get a couple of variations in there. But without some kind of hook to the combat encounter, it swiftly becomes forgettable. And forgettable combat encounters are fine, but you don't want all of your encounters to be forgettable. So my advice is to have a concept behind the combat encounter, or a thing that goes wrong in the middle of it, or a particular terrain that makes it interesting, so that it is more engaging for the players. It's more fun to fight goblins on a rolling log headed down the river where you have to keep your balance. that requires maybe a little bit of custom ruling, and it's a little bit more difficult, but it's more engaging. It's more fun if instead of fighting just a standard battalion of guards, perhaps those guards, even something as simple as having a killer hound on a leash with spikes at the end. Things like that. You just want to spice up your combat encounters a little bit. Give them interesting mechanics, ideally, interesting flair, ideally, or one or the other, because you can't always achieve both. And in that, and related to that is a general rule of dramatic tension in combat. This doesn't need to apply to all combats. They are not all made equally, and some of them are just meant to get past a couple of minions, and your adventurers will feel great about getting past them so quickly and easily. But in larger stakes battles, I prefer combat encounters to be like a miniature story in and of themselves. If you watch action movies, if you watch fantasy action sequences, all of those are constructed in a certain way, the way that you would tell a story as a whole. And so, well, it's impossible to plot a combat encounter, and doing so will be a railroading presence to your players. And the dice will make everything askew, and your players, it's like a simulator. Your players will add their own agency to the story. You can't plot it out, but you can add turning points here and there. And some of those turning points might be actions that the players take. A party that is heavy on the polymorph spell at higher levels can swiftly turn the tide of the combat and make a major shift in the battlefield by polymorphing an enemy or polymorphing one of themselves. You want things to change on the battlefield, whether somebody new teleports in or a volcanic eruption starts to happen. If you are just sword on sword on sword on sword, it comes down to just the dice, and it comes down to just whose character is better. If you can implement a general structure of dramatic tension where the enemy is picking different actions and taking different strategies throughout the combat encounter, then you will have a more satisfying combat encounter overall. Examples are, like, if you are facing a vampire lord, maybe they have an ability to raise the dead partway through, and so they do. Maybe they have an ability to transform themselves into a giant dire hound, and so they do. Something that changes the scope of the battlefield and changes the objective of the players partway through. You don't need to necessarily have a full 3 acts, like the way you would plot something in a full story, but it is something that you can play with, having a couple of turning points midway through the battle. And on that note, you need to make a decision about how pure you are going to be in running your combat encounters. Because D&D is built a little bit around the assumption that DMs have the option to fudge the dice rolls a little bit. If you prefer to run as a pure simulator DM, or your players would vastly prefer that you don't fudge the dice rolls at all, then of course play that way. That's the way the rules are designed to be played. But if you decide to fudge the dice here and there during a combat encounter, the reason you should be doing it is for that general structure. That being, the goal being a dramatic tension throughout the combat. So maybe maybe your players come up with this really last-ditch effort that hinges on a specific spell, and you know for a fact that your enemy cannot fail the saving throw on the spell without rolling something like a 2. And they've tried the spell once, they pass. They've tried the spell again, they pass. Maybe on the third time, you want to give them that in. Now, this is a hotly contested topic, and I'm not saying that's always the right call, and I'm not saying that it always has to benefit the players or it always has to benefit the villains. You can add, but you have the option. You have the option to add hit points to a villain, to make them have an ability that makes thematic sense and catches your players by surprise. Something to keep the through line of the game going. This is, again, more focused on storytelling than the pure strategy of the game. But in general, I've found that players are appreciative of dramatic moments during combat. The only thing is not to give it away. On that topic, there are a few practicalities that you can help fudge that are just for general player experience. The first comes with initiative. That's really the main thing. Initiative. Some initiatives are not fun. If all of your players go, and then all of the 17 goblins or whatever go, that is just slow for the players. But if you get, maybe your wizard comes in here, but before the ranger can back them up, or the barbarian can move to defend them, or something like that, you have the movement of your manticore, or the action of your manticore. They get a movement in there, and they get to attack the wizard, and the barbarian can only respond in so much time. Having a set initiative, potentially, for different monsters ahead of a combat encounter is something I like to do, so that big bad evil guys, say if they roll a 1 on their initiative, they are a lot less threatening, because there is a general rule of actions and effectiveness in combat, and going last diminishes that. So, depending on your bad guy, you might consider having a set initiative for the players' experience and for the general flow of things moving forward. You might want to use all of your direwolves at the same time, and all of your goblins at the same time. Rolling in groups is a way that people do it. You can develop these little systems for yourselves, particularly an initiative of who will go where, or grouping who will go where, that will make the battle feel more cohesive and less entirely random to the players, more like a story. Now, I teased on this earlier in the video and a moment ago, but a lot of DMs are concerned about balance in a combat encounter, and it is a tricky thing, which is part of why fudging dice rolls is so common. It can be used as something of a stick to lean on. If you have balanced an encounter incorrectly, and you are getting an outcome that you don't need. Adding a couple hit points here and there is a tempting option for some DMs, and making it so that not every attack misses is a tempting option for some DMs. Not every attack that the players make against the monster. Maybe their AC is so monstrously high. Maybe they don't do the entire 86 points of damage to a level 5 party. Again, there are positives and negatives to this approach. I'm not necessarily condoning or vilifying it. It is a decision to make, and it is dependent on your players. But it is part of, but balancing encounters is dependent on a general rule that I have found. The rule is that if you have two evenly matched parties, the side with the most actions tends to win. So if you have a level, that's why goblins are a popular threat, because there are so many of them. And it stands to reason. The math just plays out. If you are doing a certain amount of damage, and you have more outlets with which to do that damage, that is likely to stack up higher than somebody who maybe even does slightly more damage, but does not have quite as many outlets. That's why legendary actions are a thing. That's why lair actions are a thing. They're designed to give these giant threatening things a couple more turns in response to the player character's 4 to 6 turns that they're taking. So a good rule of thumb for balancing encounters is to look at the number of actions and how strong the monsters are in relation to the players. If the monsters are stronger than the players, but not stronger than the whole party, then maybe you want multiple of them, or maybe you want to add in a secondary monster that can help along to have that little bit of extra action economy for the evil side. Maybe instead you want to grant a slightly lower level creature a certain number of legendary actions. Lots of DMs like to take the monster manual more as a pile of suggestions, to take the stats and then add in their own legendary actions or their own lair actions, whatever works. That's an easy way to balance a combat encounter. Maybe an enemy is not supposed to have multi-attack, and you do give them multi-attack. Maybe you take away, if you want for your story purposes to fight a purple worm, but the party is much too low level to survive it, you think, and they have a low history of survivability. Maybe they don't have to attack with their stinger. Maybe they are an injured purple worm, that you can signal that to the party. The less actions that one side gets, the less likely they are to win the combat. That's why going low in the initiative order versus high in the initiative order was such a big topic of discussion earlier in this video. Higher in the initiative order, you get to get out your action. Lower in the initiative order, the actions that are taken against you are just piling on. And they can prevent you from taking your action, permanently disable you from the combat, require you to send in a little bit of healing for your comrades instead. There are numerous ways to reduce action economy when you go lower down in the ranking. Okay, so with the general rule of action economy out of the way, it naturally begs a question. How do you choose enemy actions during an encounter? Lots of the monster manual entries have multiple spells that these monsters can cast, have multiple actions that the monsters can take. All of those could be tempting options to you. How do you choose between them? The general idea is to vary it up in between. Again, if you get a slugfest going, it can get a little bit boring to your players. If you have one scariest thing that they can do over and over and over again, maybe you do that like maybe every other turn or so. So your players every other turn are they going to do that? Are they going to do that? they get hit by it, when you have a particularly high damaging melee combatant, for instance. But maybe in other scenarios, they take a different action on their stat block. If you're fighting a hill giant, maybe the most mechanically sound option isn't to pick up an enormous rock and to throw it at somebody, but it might be the one that makes for a most exciting encounter and one that varies the battlefield for your players. This brings us to the form of fudging that I actually recommend over dice roll fudging. The fudging of enemy strategy. Because strategy is all in how you present it. And the world of the game can still be very threatening even when your enemies take suboptimal actions or overly optimal actions. If you want your villains to be brutal, be smarter with your strategies, or have them be smarter with their strategies. And if you need your enemy to make a bad mechanical move for the party to keep on going, but you want to retain an air of threatening presence, it is much easier and much safer practice as a DM to have them make a move that does slightly less damage, but is described extremely threateningly and unpredictably, especially if they haven't used that action so far, than it is to fudge a dice roll and open up the avenue of just fudging whatever dice rolls whenever you want in order to get exactly the outcome that you want in every encounter. That's a bad practice. The dice roll should be, dice roll fudging should be kept to an absolute minimum if you use it at all. And choosing enemy actions with intent for your encounter and intent for your particular villains is the most important part of that. It can make things dramatic round by round. Which brings us to the most important round, the final round of combat and how to resolve a combat encounter. Now this is part of intention. Do you want, at the end of your encounter, your players feeling frustrated, triumphant, scared for what might come next? Whatever your intention is, whatever you have been building towards in this encounter, it comes down to that final round. The most common form of this is the kill shot. Who gets the kill shot? You don't get to choose as a DM which of your players takes that final shot at the end. And whoever does that final damage of your players should be rewarded in kind for that with one final shot off against the bad guy. However, if you have NPCs in the mix, perhaps they did 2 points of damage more than would be required to knock it down to a 1 hit point, and so they would have knocked them unconscious. But you want your players to have the final call, so you leave them resting at that 1 hit point. That is the okay kind of fudging for dramatic storytelling. Then your players get the satisfaction of finally finishing off this bad guy. It brings me back to a combat encounter that a DM of mine ran a while ago where my paladin was fighting his father. And his father was flying through the air and casting spells of extreme power, and this was after 5 months of campaign where my paladin had worked through being traumatized by this man again and again and again and again. And he was seeking revenge. He was at his darkest point, and my paladin was seeking revenge on his father. And then he felt he could finally put himself to rest, and finally move on and live a healthy life. I don't know anything about whether there was dice fudging in any of it. There probably wasn't. It was clearly a by the rules kind of DM. But there was a moment at the end when and all of my party had promised to leave the final killing blow to me so that I could take him out. It was arranged. The wizard had this ancient spiritual force inside of him. It was another running plot in the campaign. And that spirit took over during this final fight. The wizard let him loose. And the spirit acted brutally. It was acting against the opposite side. It was acting to our favor, but it was acting with little regard for us, and it nearly got another party member killed. And so when I was about to strike the killing blow, it was the wizard's turn, and the DM let the wizard know that the influence of the spirit was to fire and kill, and take the kill from me. And that launched off just a whole series of roleplay encounters that were possible for me, and a whole nother plot line. It allowed me to introduce another character, because my paladin walked away after that, and didn't come back until months later in game time, and went on his own quest, and had introduced different plot elements in that quest that could go on. I don't think there was dice fudging in any of that. I think it was just an action economy type thing, which is what I'm suggesting. But choosing those actions for dramatic effect, and choosing an event at the end that caps off the battle in a meaningful way will always leave your players remembering it better than if guard number 3 manages to finish off Asmodeus. That is the recommendation I have. Think about where you want the combat encounter to end, and don't have a set end point. Don't try and railroad your players. Don't fudge all the dice rolls all the time, because it is bad practice for a DM. But think about where you want the combat to end generally, and take advantage of the actions that are presented on the character sheet before you, and take advantage of actions that would be particularly dramatically potent, and try and angle yourself towards those actions. This is a storytelling game. It is not just a video game. And combat encounters, well, they are a game. Well, it is all up to your players what happens in the encounter. And well, there are a bunch of stats in front of you. You want to run them in a meaningful way that makes your characters feel like they have progressed forward or progressed back. Okay, so that is all for running combat. Of course, all of this is just advice. Again, it depends on your particular party, your particular sensibilities as a DM. These are just some good meta-narratives that I've found to help you think about how combat should be run. We'll be seeing you next time for running social encounters, which obviously, again, has a lot to do with the dramatics of the story. I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you next time with Trojan Adventuring Party's DM Workshop Series.